Hello, everybody. Welcome to Forest Biomaterials, FB 565. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about trees. Now, if you're following along, you may think, well, we've already learned something about trees, right? So what more could there be to learn about trees? Well, we learned about fibers in the context of paper making. Now we're going to learn about trees and the polymers and the other materials that go into them. And I really think it's important to not only understand the polymers, but also how that tree comes together, how that tree grows, and some characteristics of trees, and what distinguishes our hardwoods and softwoods from one another besides just fiber length, right? So we need to know some more about those types of things. So I'm going to start off here by just talking about some basics related to trees. So let me go ahead and pull up my whiteboard here and share that with you. So what is a tree? What is wood, right? So a lot of times you just think, okay, I know what a tree is, I know what wood is, it's kind of obvious, but really, if you had to define it, what would you say it is? Well, oops, hop on there. Back. Okay. And make that bigger. So, what is a tree? Right? So we can look at a tree, we can define this really as a vascular plant that develops a secondary wall consisting of wood, right? There are some other plants out there, right, that do this that you might not consider a tree, but they would be considered woody plants, right? So you have trees, and you might have things like shrubs, right? They are woody plants. The key to this is not just a vascular plant, right? So a lot of the plants, the fruits and vegetables that grow in your backyard and flowers and things like that, right, that come up every year and every spring, they are vascular plants as well. The key difference here is the secondary wall. Okay, so we're going to learn about that secondary wall, and that's what's going to distinguish this plant from other types of plants, other types of trees. Now, there's two main types of trees. You probably know them as hardwood and softwood, but really they are called gymnosperms and angiosperms. And this is a differentiation based on their seed and what their seed looks like. So, excuse me, a gymnosperm is what we call a naked seed. Okay, so it's a naked seed. These are your softwoods, right? So, if you will, your pine trees. And you think about pine trees, you think about pine cones, right? So pine cones, you can open up this pine cone and you can find the seed just comes right out of that pine cone. The seed is not covered by anything. Angiosperms, on the other hand, have a seed covering. So that seed covering could be a nut, it could be a fruit, it could be just a simple, right, covering on the outside. So the seed itself is covered by something, whereas the gymnosperm seed is not covered by something. And that's really the difference between our hardwoods and our softwoods, right? So this is this anatomical difference that you have there, and the classification is taking based by the seed and how it exists out there, right? So we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. The overall structure of the tree, and we could probably draw this tree in two ways. I'm going to kind of just simply draw the tree like this, right? It kind of comes down, okay, down over here, right? And there's some roots underneath the ground, right? And so this would be the ground level here. The tree can be broken down into three major anatomical parts, and this is both angiosperms and gymnosperms, right? The top is what we call the crown. Okay, so that's the crown that we have on the tree. This middle part here that's supporting the tree is what we call the trunk. And then these pieces down here are the roots. You could draw a similar tree over here, right? And maybe it looks like this, right? And then it has roots down below here, right below the ground. And this is maybe more of what we would see for a gymnosperm here, right? So again, though, you can easily identify the crown, the trunk, and the roots in them. So you have those three parts to a tree. Now, if we look at this, right, we would see that this trunk part, right, this part right here, is typically thought of as the commercially important part. We may actually, right, because this doesn't just end here, this extends up further. This trunk keeps going up, especially in a softwood. So we may actually come in and we may go and take all of these branches off out here. So we get a larger portion of the trunk out of this softwood to be able to go and use that commercially. Same thing over here on our hardwoods. This is hopefully extended, and if we can, we might delimb this slightly so that we can sort of get the most as we possibly can out of this for our, for our hardwood here. I just erased part of my tree. I'm gonna put my tree back here, right? So looking at how does that maybe extend up into this other portion up here, right? So that trunk is a really commercially important part. A lot of times these limbs up on top are usually left in the forest when we go through our harvesting operation here. Down below in the ground here is our roots, right? And so the roots a lot of times really don't have a lot of value to us, right? So we're not using those commercially, at least traditionally speaking. Now, if we take this tree and we cut this tree off, right, and we are left with a stump here, historically speaking, this is where we got what we call our navel stores from, right? So our navel stores would come out of here. This is going to be the pitch and what we call pine tar that would have traditionally been used in boats and ships to be able to seal up those wooden boats and ships and make them watertight, right? So to make them resistant, also to infestation, but also to cover the gaps and creases and make them watertight. So historically speaking, the stumps had a good bit of value in them. There's still some people who will harvest the stumps out of softwoods to try to take those navel stores and extractives out and use them for different sorts of things. Today, you know, like I said, that still exists, but it's probably not as big of a operation as you might usually see. Now in our next drawing over here, I'm going to imagine that we cut this tree and we're going to look down at the cut face of this tree here. So we're going to look down at the cut face of this tree here. The tree, right, in the center of the tree, right, there's going to be a round spot in the center, and it is that round spot in the center we're going to call the pith of the tree. The pith of the tree. Clean that up a little bit. So that center part is the pith of the tree. Now, as this tree grows, I'm going to change colors here. We're going to get these rings that keep growing around and around, and the tree is slowly going to increase in diameter, right? Getting bigger and bigger, and eventually that tree is going to make a transition at some point in time. I'm just going to put this in as a dotted line, where this inner portion inside of here is what we call juvenile wood, right? So juvenile wood. That's wood that is not mature, okay? So there's juvenile wood and mature wood. Well, what does that mean, not mature? I want you to take that as that means that it doesn't have all the properties that the mature wood would have. It might have shorter fiber length, it might have different chemistry content, right? So different ratios of cellulose and hemicellulose and lignin that are in there, and all of these sorts of things inside towards the center of this tree. Now that tree, after it's a juvenile, hopefully then, and there's no dotted red line on there, usually that juvenile wood exists for the first 10 years, 15 years or so. There's no set date on when you make the transition, but then eventually you start getting, right, on the outside, the mature wood, right? So we go from the juvenile wood, then outside of the juvenile wood, we will have the mature wood. You will also see sometimes as this tree keeps on growing, we're going to grow it a little bit more, that you're going to get another type of wood that develops. And sometimes you can see it and sometimes you can't see it. It's what we call, towards the center, it's what we call the heartwood, right? So towards the center would be the heartwood. And towards the outside would be the sapwood. Okay, so we have heartwood towards the center and sapwood towards the outside. How do we differentiate these two, right? So I said juvenile wood versus mature wood. Those are differentiated based on things like fiber length and chemistry. What about heartwood and sapwood, right? So these two areas don't always coincide with one another. Well, heartwood is essentially, I'm going to put in quotes here, dead. In other words, it doesn't function in the biological processing of the tree. It's not moving stuff up and down. It's not doing any of those sorts of things. It's towards the center of the tree. It's older wood towards the center of the tree. And it's probably providing some mechanical support inside of the tree, but it's not really helping in the biological processing. Out here, the sapwood, I'm going to put this in quotes, is alive, right? And I say it's alive because it's helping in the biological functioning of the tree. In this case, there's water that may be moving up and down through this. It may be used as a place to store, right, some sap and things like that that can help help the tree when it's going dormant or when it's starting up, waking up in the morning or making through the night. If you look inside this tree, you're going to find some living cells in this part of the tree, right? So not all of the wood is alive, but there's going to be some living cells inside of it, right? So we have the heartwood on the inside, which is dead, and we have the sapwood on the outside that's alive. Now, as you get to the outside of this tree, right, so you're going to get all the way to the outside of the tree, and around the outside of the tree, right, so you look at the outside of the tree, and what do you have out there? When you look at a tree, this outside layer is the bark, right? So the outside layer on this tree is the bark. Now, what happens? Where does bark come from? See, I used to never know this, right? So this is one of those things I learned when I was in botany class. I didn't know this. Well, where does the bark come from? On the outside here, we have bark. On the inside, we have wood. And in between the two, I'm going to try to draw it around here. It's not going to be easy. I'm going to draw it in blue. There's going to be a layer, right? So bear with me here. It's not so easy to get it all the way around. It's like tracing and trying to stay inside the lines, right? So there's going to be a layer that runs all the way around the outside. And that layer is what we know is the cambium. The cambium. And this layer is definitely alive and growing. This is really interesting, and we're going to take a little bit deeper look at this, okay? The cambium is alive and growing. So this layer going on the outside is actually growing bark in this direction, and towards the inside is growing wood, right? So it's actually growing bark. So the tree grows bark. It's not just dead wood that's like pushed to the outside, or it's just decaying off the outside. The tree is growing the bark, pushing it towards the outside. In fact, some trees grow a lot of bark, right? So like a crazy amount of bark, so much so that you can use them to make products just out of the bark, and you can shave it off the outside and then go back and shave it again in a couple of years off the outside again. And you're probably familiar with that bark. That bark is cork, right? So cork is what's shaved off the outside of a cork tree, right? So it's actually bark is what you're looking at there. It's this cork tree on the outside. All right, so let me just review this drawing here, and then we're going to look at some other figures in a little more detail. So in the center here, we have our pith. That pith, the wood grows from the outside, producing these growth rings. We're going to talk about those growth rings a little bit more. You get to a point where you have juvenile wood in the center, and then the wood eventually matures. There's a change in the properties as time goes on. Now, when the tree gets older, you end up with heartwood in the center. Doesn't necessarily just mean the juvenile wood. It can extend out into the mature wood as well. And you're going to have the sapwood. That is, I say here alive because it's happening or it's supporting the biological functioning of the tree. And it's usually just the first outside inch or 2 inches of the tree itself. Then on the very outside of the tree, of course, you have the bark, and the layer in between is the cambium, growing wood to the inside and producing bark towards the outside.